Ruth is a story that takes place because someone did what was right in their own eyes. This is one of the most beloved stories of our Bibles. And not only that, this is widely recognized as one of the great literary classics of humankind. This is one of the greatest works that humans have produced in terms of a story. And it is a touching story that grabs at our heartstrings. Oftentimes we think of this story of Ruth as a love story. The Bible's version of a Cinderella tale even begins in the Bible's version of Once Upon a Time, and ends in the Bible's version of They Lived Happily Ever After. And between the beginning and the end there we find a young girl, a young maid, so to speak, who is destitute or on the verge of destitution, and along comes her prince and rescues her. And that's often the way that the book of Ruth is understood, and all those things are true. This is a love story. This is a story of a rescue. But that is not the main point whatsoever. It's not even close. It's not even the secondary point. The story of Ruth is a story that is mature in its theological teaching. It is refined and indeed not light in the theological truths that will be presented to us in the story of Ruth. Among the themes that we will encounter as we spend the next, I would say, about 6 weeks in the book of Ruth, among the themes that we'll encounter are the themes of the significance and the importance of the covenant community of God. The theme of God's plan to graft into the covenant people Gentiles, particularly Gentile women, to be grafted into the covenant people of God. The theme of famine, and how famine is often a judgment of God, but famine, more times than not, is a means that God uses to move His people from one place to another. We think of Abraham, more than once, was moved from one place to another by means of a famine. His son Isaac, same thing. The nation of Israel was moved to Egypt by means of a famine. So God often uses famines to relocate His people to a place that He would like them to be. We're also going to see, of course, the plight of widows in the ancient world, which is always a prominent theme in the Scriptures. And it will be, of course, a theme front and center in the Scriptures, the plight of widows in the ancient world, because we're going to find in the very first chapter 3 of them. Also, we'll see the theme of faith, true and genuine faith. And we'll also see the theme of the faithfulness of God towards His people. We will see also the theme of the reality of living in a fallen world. We will also see the themes, the 2 major themes, I would call them, the 2 central themes of the book are, first of all, the preservation of the seed of promise, which we've talked about on many occasions before, which is one of the grand themes, if not the grand theme of the Old Testament, which there's this theme that there's the seed. The seed will come and the seed will crush the head of the serpent. But on almost every turn of the Old Testament, that seed or the line of the seed is very nearly extinguished. It's very nearly lost. So many occasions come up through our Old Testaments. We won't recount them now, but so often these occasions come up in which the promised seed, the line of the seed, is nearly cut off. And none of those instances are greater than, of course, the story of Ruth, where the promised seed is nearly not born. But we'll see that theme. And then, of course, the central theme of the book is the theme of God's providence. But this is not the theme of God's providence as you might expect. Because God's providence, as presented to us in the story of Ruth, is unique to the Scriptures. Nowhere else in the Scriptures will you find God's providence presented in such a way as it's presented in the story of Ruth. It's a unique little book for us. It's the only book in the Old Testament that's named after a Gentile female. We know that there's, of course, 2 books in our Old Testaments named after females. Ruth and, of course, Esther. Esther was Jewish, though. There are a couple of books in our New Testaments that are named after Gentiles. Luke, and then, of course, Timothy. But the only book in all of our Scripture named after a Gentile woman is the book that's named after Ruth. But what we'll find as we walk through the story is Ruth is not the central character, nor is she even the second most central character. She plays third fiddle in the terms of characters. And the author says more about two other characters, namely Boaz and Naomi. He says more about them. We have more information about both of them, and they both have more dialogue than does Ruth. So the story is not about Ruth as the central character, yet it's named after her. Just a couple of words here about just the background of the book, and then we'll get started. This is customary for us as we begin a new story, just to know a little bit about how it comes to us. We don't know who wrote the book of Ruth, nor do we know when the book of Ruth was written. The only thing that we can surmise is that it was written at least by the time of David. And we know that by means of the fact that the end of the book ends with the genealogy that leads up to David. And the only way the author could know the genealogy leading up to David was if David was already born. So it takes place, it's written at least by the time David was on the scene, perhaps even later. As far as who wrote it, the best guess would be Samuel, but that's purely a guess. We have no idea who wrote it, whether it was a man or a woman, but in either case, we find that the book of Ruth is a tremendously well-preserved book for us. We're pausing, I should say, in our study through the book that is, I guess it holds the distinction of the book of our New Testaments that has the most textual variants. We talked about that on a couple of occasions, the textual variants in Mark, and we've wrestled through many of those. So now we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, and we find that the book of Ruth is probably the most well-preserved book of our Bibles. Oftentimes we might think about what's called the Masoretic text. I don't know if you've ever heard about the Masoretic text, but the Masoretic text is a body of Old Testament scriptures that dates to about 1000 A.D. The Masoretic text was the basis for the King James translation. But then sometime afterwards, around the middle of the 20th century, there was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran texts. And the discovery of those scrolls gave us access to the same books of the Old Testament that were 1,000 years older. So it might be interesting for you to hear that between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text, 1,000 years later, there is exactly one textual variant in the entire book of Ruth. That comes in chapter 3 and verse 14, in which the Masoretic text has the word feet as plural, and the Qumran text has the word foot as singular. And that is the only textual variant in the entire book over more than 1,000-year period. So it's an extremely well-preserved book for us. But all that being said, that's enough to say about the manuscripts and the books and the author and the date and those sorts of things. Now let's just simply jump into the story. Let's begin by reading our story. We'll cover today the first 18 verses. And we'll begin this morning by reading those verses together. From verse 1, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, from the name of the one who was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way. For I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. I wonder if I might tease your imagination just a bit this morning and have you imagine with me a field, just an ordinary, regular field. In this case, it would be a barley field growing a harvest of barley. And this field is early in the morning. There's still some mist coming up from the field. But as you look in your imagination and you see this field, you see that there are workers who are harvesting the barley crop. And as you watch these workers harvesting the barley crop, and they're tying it together in sheaves and stacking the sheaves, as you look closer, you also notice some women, some poor women. You know they're poor because their clothes are ragged and faded and worn out. Their hair is disheveled, and they're rather dirty. But these women are going behind the workers, and they're picking up the pieces that the workers have dropped. They're going to the corners of the field, and they're taking some barley that was left in the very corners of the field, and they're taking it and holding it close to their breast and then leaving with it. And as you watch this scene unfold, now the scene fades, and the next scene fades in. The next scene takes place in the very same field, only now the scene is in the late afternoon. And as you watch this scene from afar, you can tell it's the same field, but there's a completely different thing going on now. For now there's a strange sight. It's the sight of 7 brothers standing over to one side along with their father, with a rather concerned, odd look on their face. But then closer to you, you see a man whom you can tell is a very important man. He's distinguished in the way that he holds himself. He's distinguished in the way that he is dressed. He looks to you to be a priest. He looks to you to be a person of authority. And at his feet is a teenage boy kneeling. And this man is pouring oil into the hair of this teenage boy. And he's placing his hands on the boy and he's speaking some words. All the while, the 7 brothers and the father are looking on in complete and utter disbelief. Now that scene fades, and the next scene fades in, and it's the very same field. Now, yet another 1,000 years later, but only now it takes place at night. You see the field at night, and in this field now there's a flock of sheep. And those sheep are being herded and cared for by some shepherds. The shepherds have maybe ended their day. They're gathered around a campfire and they're joking and laughing at the things that shepherds laugh and joke about. And as they're gathered around the campfire in the dark of the night, you witness the entire field lit up in brilliant light. And the shepherds fall to their knees, gazing up into the sky. And you hear these voices, these angelic, non-human voices, saying to these shepherds, "Fear not, fear not, for your Savior is born to you in the city of Bethlehem." You see, this field is a field in the region of Bethlehem. And in our imaginations, we imagine it to be the very same place. We don't know that. There's no reason that it's not the very same field, for it certainly is the very same region that all 3 of these events take place. But it's the first of those events that we'll turn our attention to now. Look with me now at verse 1. "In the days when the judges ruled." That's perhaps the most important, or one of the most important phrases in the book. Because that phrase sets the context for us. It sets the scene, tells us when the story took place. In the days when the judges ruled. So the judges, the period of the judges, this tells us what was happening in the world of Ruth and Naomi and Elimelech as these events took place. The period of the judges was, without a doubt, one of the most tumultuous, chaotic, and violent periods in Israel's history. Second only to the period around the life of Elijah, the period at which the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had reached the low point. They had spiraled down to the lowest point, and King Ahab and all that, remember that story. That would take the cake, so to speak, of the lowest point in Israel's spiritual history. But second to that, a close second to that, would be the period of the Judges. So what happened in the period of the Judges was Israel, of course, they had Moses. And Moses was their leader. And Moses led them for 40 years. And then Moses died. Well, then God raises up Joshua. And Joshua turns out to be a supernaturally anointed leader, a supernaturally anointed general who takes them into the promised land. And they defeat the people of the promised land with unparalleled success. The walls of Jericho crumble as they merely shout. The waters of the Jordan stop as they walk across the banks of the Jordan without even getting their sandals muddy. Armies that are far bigger and stronger and better trained and better equipped run in the face of them. All of these supernatural events lead to the conquest of the land. And now Israel is on this high, so to speak. But then Joshua dies. And they're left once again leaderless. Then we enter the period of the Judges. The period of the Judges was a decadent period, financially, economically. It was a decadent period, from a period of great civil unrest, a period of tremendous violence. During the period of Judges, where that story that we're all familiar with, most likely we're familiar with in any case, was the story of the man who was traveling with his concubine, and he stops over for the night, and his concubine sleeps outside while he sleeps inside. Well, some men come and they abuse the concubine so violently all night long that she dies at the break of day. And the man is so angry that he dismembers her into many pieces and sends a piece of her into each region of the land of Israel. That's the type of thing that the story of Judges is about. Judges is the only book of the Bible that I've ever preached through that about 2/3 of the way through, the people to whom I was preaching came to me and said, we really appreciate the things that you're showing us in the book of Judges, but we will be glad when this is over because this is so violent. It is the most violent book of the Old Testament. And that's the period of life that the Judges occupied. And so Joshua now is off the scene, but then God raises up these judges, these deliverers, these redeemers. And there are many that occur in the story of Judges. Some of them are well known: Gideon, Samson, Deborah. Many others are less well known, but the point is that there were many of them, and they all are raised up by God to deliver the people in a certain situation in a certain time, and then they leave the scene. And so we go from Moses to Joshua to now judge after judge after judge after judge. If there's one thing that's clear to the people is we need a king who will stay. We need a king who will come and not leave us. We need a king who will come and deliver us and keep us delivered. And throughout the entire chaotic, tumultuous period of the Judges, this is the sense in which Israel's neighbors continue to commit violence against them, to come and steal their crops, to come and steal their women, to come and murder them and brutally treat them. And throughout this entire period, Israel is becoming more and more spiritually decadent. We see that phrase. In fact, if you were to look, if you're in a pew Bible, if you look at just the previous page, but even your own Bible, you look at the very last verse of the book of Judges, the very last verse before the beginning of the story of Ruth. And you'll see that phrase repeated 4 times. There was no king in Israel. And then 3 of those times it's followed by the next phrase, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Ruth is a story that takes place because someone did what was right in their own eyes. That gives rise to the entire story of Ruth, because this was the time in which people were doing what was right in their own eyes. But throughout this incredibly spiritually tumultuous season, this time of incredible spiritual darkness, I don't know if you can relate to this. I don't know if you can sense a parallel between our time and theirs, a time in which it seems so chaotic and the future seems so uncertain, and we seem so unsure, not only about where we're going, but where we came from. I don't know if you can see the parallels between now and the time of the Judges, but if you can't, you might want to go home this afternoon and read the story of Judges, and you will see that that is a story about a period of time that is so much like ours that it's stunning. But in the midst of that story comes the Bible's most beautiful story. Much in the same way as a diamond looks more beautiful on the backdrop of the black velvet cloth. You know, when you go to the jewelry store, they don't just take out the diamond and show you the diamond. They put that little black velvet cloth down so that they put the diamond on that so that the diamond, which in and of itself is beautiful, looks far more beautiful on a dark background. The same sort of effect takes place in the story of Ruth. It's easy to read the story of Ruth and just think that we're reading this Cinderella story that starts tragically, but everything's going to work out in the end. It's easy to lose sight of what's going on in the world around Ruth and around Naomi during this entire story. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So already we're 2 phrases into the book, and we've now experienced 2 tragedies. The first tragedy is that we live in this period of the Judges, the most spiritually despotic period of within 1,000 years of the nation of Israel. And not only the tragedy of living in such a time of spiritual wandering and spiritual aimlessness, there was a famine in the land. Famines are often God's means of bringing judgment onto people. And we don't know if the famine was the direct result of God withholding rains, or perhaps the indirect result of God sending the Midianites or the Moabites in to conquer them and steal their crops as they often did. We don't know. But there was a famine in the land, and that's also something that's easy to pass over. Because one thing is true, and one thing that everyone in the room can agree with, is you have no idea what a famine is about, and neither do I. None of us have the first clue about what a famine is like, because modern man is so, or at least modern Western man, is so removed from the idea of a famine that we find it even something that we cannot even relate to. What do you do when you're hungry? You get food. You go to the supermarket, and what's in the supermarket? Shelves of food. And it's always been that way your whole life. Even in that crazy COVID time when there were some empty shelves, there was still plenty of food. You have no idea, neither do I, what it's like to hear your children cry because their stomach hurts from emptiness and literally have nothing to give them to put into it. And no idea when you will get something, because you will not get any food until the rains come. And you have no idea when the rains are coming. And that was something of life in the ancient world. Famine was a reality, and it was a harsh reality. Throughout the story, there's going to be two characters that will be very easy for us to heap blame upon, Elimelech and Naomi. But the fact of the matter is, we weren't there. We didn't hear our children crying and no food to put into their mouth. We didn't experience the fearfulness of not having anything for the next meal and no idea when we would get anything for the next meal. But there's this famine, now this double tragedy in the land. This famine was in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. There's the third tragedy. We aren't even finished with the first verse, and we've now been faced with 3 tragedies. Number 1, they're living in this time of spiritual aimlessness. Number 2, there's a famine in the land. Now this family is going to go to find some food, and we want to cry out, don't go to Moab. Wherever you go, don't go there. Because if we're familiar at all with the story of the Judges, we're familiar with the fact that the Moabites were Israel's sworn enemy. They were the most hated enemy of ancient Israel. It would be tantamount to, most of us in the room can remember what life was like in the 70s and 80s. Remember in the 70s and 80s, can you imagine if someone would have said to you, I just really don't like the way things are going here. I think I'm going to move to the Soviet Union. You get a sense of what that would have been like to have heard those words, to move to our arch enemy? Don't go to Moab, go anywhere but Moab. We're reminded of the fact that the Moabite people were God's sworn enemies from the very beginning. Their very beginnings were the beginnings of moral despotism. Back from Genesis chapter 19, remember the story of Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of the city. And then Lot and his family leave the city. Lot's wife looks back, turns into a pillar of salt. So Lot and then his two daughters go into the cave. And in the cave, the two daughters, the eldest daughter says to the younger daughter, this is in your notes, I won't read it for you, but let us get our father drunk and lay with him so that our seed can continue, so that our lineage can continue, so that we might not be extinct. And so they do this. The first one is the eldest daughter, and she conceives and brings forth a son and names him Moab. And he becomes the father of the Moabite people, a people born from sexual perversion, sexual deviancy, a people born from immorality that is disgusting to us. That was the birth of these people. They became known in the ancient world. The Moabite women became known for their sexual perversion, for their sexual looseness. People would say, all the loose women, they live in Moab. All the Moabite women, they're the loose women. If you want some loose women, go over there to Moab. That was the reputation that they had. We find in Numbers chapter 21, we find that we're told that the Moabite women seduced the Israelite men to sin with them, and then sinning with them to also worship their gods as well. We find God's words against them in Deuteronomy saying, because the Moabites would not help my people as they were crossing the land, have nothing to do with them. No Moabite is to ever enter the assembly of God's people to the 10th generation. Interestingly, scholars have dated Ruth to the 11th generation of that generation that God spoke against. But that's another story altogether. So the Moabite people, we want to say to Elimelech, not there. Go anywhere else but Moab. Don't go to God's sworn enemies of people. But yet they went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech. So here we come across the first irony. The book of Ruth is a masterful work of literature. And for most of its mastery, we're going to struggle a little bit to see it because we're, of course, not reading it in Hebrew, but we'll try to understand what we can. Much of it also can be seen even in the English because it is truly a masterful work of literature. But here we come across one of the first literary devices. The author uses irony, and he uses it very unsparingly. The name of the man was Elimelech. The man's name has a meaning. In fact, all the names in the book of Ruth have spiritual meaning. The meaning of the name Elimelech is, my God is king. You can see it there. El, that's the word for God, the Hebrew word for God, such as El Shaddai, God Almighty. El is the word for God. We've talked recently about the I sound at the end, how that makes it possessive. Eli means not God, but my God. So Eli as a name means my God or God is mine. And then the word Melech is the Hebrew word for king. So my God is king. Ironically, he's the one person in the story that is not acting like God is the king of the land. Because he's leaving the land of promise, the land in which God has promised to provide for his people, the land in which God's presence is most distinctly known, most tangibly known. Elimelech is going to leave. The man whose very name means my God is king is the one who acts like his God is impotent.